All right, let's finish this portion up. Again, we're talking about the intellectual problem of evil. What do we do with the issue of gratuitous evil? I think this is a deep and still a powerful challenge, and we should admit that. I think we should just be honest with it. We should be honest about our struggle as we come to terms with a good God who does permit evil and suffering. I mean, some of that is mysterious for us, and it can cause some doubts for our faith. What do we have to say about that, at least intellectually at first? Certainly, a number of philosophers, and again, I've already referred to them, so it's not original with me. We do recognize we have human limitations on our understanding. It may be the case that God has certainly it's logically possible, that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting evils, like a truck driver accidentally killing a kid. Or take a drunk driver who's intentionally driving and is drunk, killing many people, right? That's even worse. We may not be able to explain particular evils, but it doesn't follow from that God doesn't have morally sufficient reasons for permitting those kinds of evils. We're just simply not in a position to say that it's improbable that God lacks good reasons for permitting the suffering in the world. So here, the challenger, the atheist, the agnostic, or even the Christian who might even raise a challenge like this in a moment, they have a heavy burden. They have to be able to demonstrate that God can't, even logically can't, have morally sufficient reasons for permitting certain evils. And I've already given a couple of illustrations of why even just humans who are limited, like in their parenting or mentoring, will permit certain amounts of suffering, right? To allow people to mature, to not have their kids be narcissists, right? We were just talking a moment ago. What if me and my wife ran around with our little kids with pillows, so anytime that they fell, we would catch them, right? They would start to think that they were the center of the universe, and they wouldn't mature, right? To know and love and care about other people. They would think they're the center of the universe. So that's a big problem, right? So we have some limitations in our understanding, and that's okay to admit. We also want to try to see the big picture. Years ago, when I was growing up, learning to drive, we didn't have GPS in the car. What we had to do is you had to turn on the radio, and when you're in traffic, you would listen to a guy who was up in a helicopter describing what was going on down the road, and then you would make your decisions, right? You couldn't see the big picture. You had to rely on the guy in the helicopter. Now we rely on Google Maps and the information that's coming in, but we're still relying on something bigger than us.
Thank God for technology.
Yeah, these days. William Lane Craig makes this point. He says, if we look at the relative full scope of the evidence, he says that God's existence is probable, right? We can use the Kalam cosmological argument. You heard the design argument from Hugh and Jeff. I gave you the moral argument. There's an argument from religious experience in that. And so when you look at all these arguments and you look at religious experience, it just seems that on balance, in the big picture, it seems like God exists even if we don't know the reasons that he permits evil, right? It may be the case that I just remain agnostic about those reasons. And if the agnostic or atheist can't show that God doesn't have morally sufficient reasons, well then I'm rationally permitted to live under that understanding, okay? Again, Craig makes this point. When you look at the balance of things, he says, if you look at all the arguments for God's existence, that kind of outweighs, in one sense, the suffering in the world. Meaning that God exists, and it's likely that he has morally sufficient reasons for permitting suffering. So we may not know the reasons that God permits suffering. But it doesn't follow from that God doesn't exist. Does that make sense to you? Right? If the arguments work, or if you've had a religious experience with God, right? You may be convinced, and I think rightly so, that God exists, but not have any answers for why he allows specific evils. All right? Craig and Stephen Davis make this point, that suffering makes more sense under a Christian understanding of the world rather than an agnostic or an atheistic or skeptical view of the world. Why is that so? Let's offer some reasons. I'll repeat some of the reasons that they give. And I find these fairly compelling. So Christianity, Craig says, entails certain doctrines that increase the probability that God exists and suffering exists. And he makes this illustration. Just briefly, I'll put it with you. I work at APU, and at Azusa Pacific, you have to sign a code of ethics. Even though you don't have to be a Christian to go there, though we have many Christians, you still have to sign a code of ethics. So one of the things is no alcohol, no drinking on campus, these kinds of things, right? So what's the probability that if you meet 100 students on APU's campus, that you're going to bump into someone who drinks beer regularly?
70%. Probably accurate.
It's much lower than that. Let's say it's 15%, right? Now, not everyone obeys the laws, right? But what if I go over to UCLA and there's no restrictions? In fact, they got pubs on campus. How many people are going to drink beer there? 80, 90%, right? So depending on the background information, that helps determine some of the probabilities. Does that make sense to you? If I go to UCLA, I'm more inclined to think, probabilistically, that I'm going to interact or meet up with some beer drinkers. If I go over to APU, yeah, some of the people still do it, but it's much more minimized, right? The background information determines the probabilities in this case. So when you think about, well, what's the probability that God can permit evil in the world and he could still be good and have his various purposes? Let's talk about some of these. One Christian doctrine is that the goal or the purpose of humankind is the knowledge of God and not personal happiness. Most people's view, probably today, just generally speaking, is that they would kind of think that God should ensure our happiness first. Like we're almost like God's pets or something like that. No, if you want to be happy, God realizes that you have to know him, and the byproduct is happiness, not the other way around. Why is that? Because God is the good. Right? So if you don't seek after the Sunan Bolan, the good, the ultimate good, then you're always going to fall off the track. You're going to miss happiness. So it's the knowledge of God that God has to provide first in order for us to be happy. We tend to want to pursue happiness directly, but then it just sort of runs away from us, right? Well, does this actually turn out to be the case, right? We can raise the question, does suffering create atheists and agnostics? You will hear the challenge many times, the Holocaust created, tons of atheists and agnostics out of it. Certainly a horrific event. Is that actually the case? When we see suffering in the world and pain, does that actually create agnostics, right? Or things? If you look at world history, an interesting phenomenon has happened. This comes out of the Lausanne Task Force. Back in around 100, you had about 180 million non-Christians. Committed Christians, you had close to around 500,000. Okay? Now, as you look down through the time, right, you come all the way, let's say, to the 90s, you have 3 billion people on Earth. and you have about 500 million Christians. Now we look at those ratios, okay? So back in AD 100, you have about 360 non-Christians to every one Christian. Around today, it might even be lower. Now you have only 7 non-Christians to every one Christian. Now think of the 20th century. We've had two big world wars, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. Think of all the other conflicts. Go back a few hundred years before that, you had the Civil War, right? You would think that these incredible, terrible conflicts would have just created thousands upon thousands, if not millions upon millions of atheists. But what do you see? It's the exact opposite.
That's what you showed us with the Buddhists in the caste system. Those that are on the lowest, that are suffering the most, are the most open to the gospel.
They're the most, they end up being the most open. So not that, I'm not arguing that God causes the suffering. Please don't hear that. Okay? But that in the midst of people's pain and suffering, from moral evil and even natural evil, you actually have more people coming to know God and be committed to God than the reverse. That's good news. That's amazing news. That quite the opposite is happening. In fact, it should give us a deep sense of confidence and hope that when we are encountering the truck driver or our friend who's going through something, or we go through something, that God is strong enough, powerful enough to overcome that pain and that suffering, to ease the burden in that process. It's a pretty powerful thing. Secondly, there's a Christian doctrine that human beings are in a state of rebellion against God. So what should we expect?
Rebellion.
Well, pain and suffering.
Pain and suffering, yeah.
Right? When I was a pastor, people would come to the church and they would say things like, I thought I was going to find all good people here. Right? I said, well, I think there are good people here, but we're more of a hospital than we are, a cruise ship. We're here to help repair people, to restore them into goodness. So you're going to meet a lot of people who are in messes, right? You shouldn't expect that. You should expect that we're working through our stuff. Thirdly, the knowledge of God spills over into the afterlife or eternity. Many times, the atheist or the agnostic, even the Christian many times, forgets of that life doesn't end in our 50 years or our 70 years, right? We have an everlasting life available to us. Well, what does that mean in practical terms? You could live a life of 50 years, 60 years of maybe even terrible suffering. And you die, and then God says, come into my house, come to me, my good and faithful servant, right? And then your everlasting life begins. So let's just say this is the span of your life. And there was a lot of pain and suffering, right? Maybe you went through a war or whatever it was. And it ends here. God welcomes you into his kingdom, and then you begin. Right? Does anyone know Amazing Grace?
Yes.
The words? Right?
Yes.
Help me with the phrase. When we've been there
10,000
years,
bright shining as the sun,
we have
no less days to sing his praise than when we first began.
70 years, heavenly life, there's 70 years. The hymn says, now we're at 10,000 years. We have no less days than when we first begun. So I can start walking out the room, we're at 1 million years. We're at 2 million years. I'm down the highway at the beach, right? We're at 7 million years. We have no less days to see. How does this start to look? How big does this start to look in 1 million years? Yeah, really, really small. It's like one bad night in a hotel room. But I don't want to minimize the suffering that people undergo. But when we look at it to what Paul says, the weight of glory that we have, this will pale in comparison. It's a pretty interesting reflection. Finally, the knowledge of God is what philosophers and theologians call an incommensurable good. It never ends, right? It's like the Energizer Bunny. It just keeps going and going and going. In other words, God's good nature and anything he creates is inexhaustible. There's a reservoir that just you'll never be able to fully drink. Right? And these are doctrines that if they're true, then we would expect evil and suffering in the world. People are in rebellion. But at the same time, God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting, for a time, certain evils, because he can restore goodness, and he can restore it for a really long time. Now think of what the atheist has to say. Bertrand Russell, who was a famous atheist, once said this: what does the Christian, he wrote a book called Why I'm Not a Christian. What does the Christian have to say to the little girl dying of leukemia in the hospital? What do they have to say? What if we played out that scenario? You're the minister or friend, you're in the hospital talking to an 8-year-old who has leukemia, they're going to die, right? What do we say at that time? Now, but what others have said, what does the atheist have to say? Don't worry, you'll soon be extinguished. That's the way the cookie crumbles. You know, I don't think that's very comforting. But the Christian, what does the Christian have to say?
This isn't the end.
This is not the end. God can provide comfort. You can provide comfort at that moment. But this is not the end. Actually, as Craig puts it in his book, he actually says, while evil is a challenge for the Christian, at the end of the day, it becomes actually evidence for God. Here's the argument. I really like this one. He says, if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. We talked about that with the moral argument, right? We discussed that. But evil exists, right? Everyone agree? Yeah, everyone agrees. Well, if evil exists, then what? Then objective moral values exist, right? Because if evil exists, then you have to have a contrast to it. There has to be good. Many people think that good can exist without evil, but it's actually the opposite. Evil can't exist without good. So, therefore, objective moral values exist. What's the conclusion? It follows logically and inescapably, therefore God exists, from premise 1. If God doesn't exist, then there's no such thing as moral values. But wait a minute, evil does exist, but that implies that good exists. Well, that means objective moral values exist, but if they exist, that means God exists. So it actually turns out to be an argument for God's existence. Now again, let me repeat, I don't mean to be overly repetitive, but this may not be emotionally satisfying if you're struggling with the weight and burden of evil. I get that. But intellectually, this is different. This is some powerful stuff. Any questions on that? There has been a response to this. Some atheists have said this: evil is just irrational. Here's what they mean by it. I forget who was telling me. I think it was Nate was telling me. Someone like Albert Camus, who was an existentialist, atheistic philosopher, said, look, if God, he agrees, if God doesn't exist, there is no morality. So he's what's called a nihilist. It means no value. There's no value, meaning, or purpose in the world. So he bites the bullet. He says, that's right, God doesn't exist, there's no meaning, value, or purpose. So there is no such thing as morality. Then what do you do with evil? He agrees that evil exists, but how does he categorize it? He puts it in an intellectual category and says it's just irrational. This is a really interesting move. And it permeates our culture right now. So the next time something bad happens, watch how people will start to use phrases like, well, that person was crazy, right? They were stupid. These are all intellectual categories, right? There was something wrong with their brain.
What's wrong with it?
Right? But what we would say is that, no, that person was immoral. They weren't irrational. There's actually a lot of people who do evil that are very rational, actually. And that goes against this view. You can be extremely rational, but very bad. So we shouldn't be fooled that just because you're smart, that means you're also good. You have to develop goodness alongside of your smartness, your intellectual maturity. That's a really, really important point in our culture.
Smartness is a stumbling block to being.
The what?
Sometimes smartness is a stumbling block to being good.
I actually don't.
Not always.
It doesn't need to be, right? Because you're right that as you increase in your knowledge, you could become prideful, right? The Christian answer to that is, in your knowledge, you would also develop morally and be humble. And you can do that spiritually in a relationship with God and his community, right? So there's an answer to that. In fact, you might actually be interested. This was really helpful to me as a pastor. I know, huh? I'm pretty good. I feel very powerful.
Well, you didn't actually destroy the apple.
So, right, you have an intellectual dimension to your life, right? What's the goal of your intellectual life? What do you want to achieve? Huh? Yeah. Knowledge, truth. This is the goal, the purpose of it. But if this is all you cultivate, you're going to lack other things. How many people go through college and all they focus on is their intellectual life? Well, you're going to be anemic because there's other dimensions in your life. For instance, you have a moral dimension. What's the goal of your moral life?
To be right.
To be good. To be right. Right not in the true sense, but you want to achieve moral goodness or moral perfection ultimately, right? But you just don't have a moral dimension. You also have what's called an aesthetic dimension. Does anyone know what the goal of this would be? Any of you who are artists, musicians?
Pleasure?
Huh?
Pleasure?
No? Yeah. You want to achieve or create beauty. Did I spell that right?
Yeah.
Now, some people only focus on this, and they become very knowledgeable. They might be a neurosurgeon, they could be a computer scientist, but they're bad people. Some people can be really good, but they lack knowledge, and so they have good intentions, but they do a lot of evil. They harm people. So you can be good, but still harm people, because you don't have wisdom. That's really interesting. People don't make these distinctions today. I've gone through hundreds of intro philosophy classes. Students, and our culture just doesn't make these distinctions anymore. It used to. And they leave out this dimension. This is non-existent. What's the goal of the spiritual dimension? What do you want to achieve?
Intimacy with the Lord.
Yeah. Sometimes you could say unity or intimacy would be another good word. Loving union with God, right? Some people can be close to God, but not develop the other things. How many sermons? I mean, you guys are a little younger. I probably heard more and given more than you have. But how many sermons only reduce things to the moral dimension? How many sermons have you heard about creating beauty Your role in life is partially to create beauty.
Rick?
Rick knows it, yeah. So you're in a good context. Or sometimes a sermon will only just focus on the spiritual part, but God has created these other dimensions for you to fulfill. One of the most important things while you're, and you get it in this environment, but while you're studying intellectually, is making sure that you also have areas where you're creating beauty, or that you're getting beauty in your life. One of the most important things for me as a pastor, I would counsel lots of people in very tough situations, and I would come out of that really, really heavy. I mean, I was carrying their burdens along with me. And it was really important for me to have activities where I was either able to engage beauty or create beauty. So I was a musician. It was very important for me to go play music. It was a sense of accomplishment. People's lives just don't close after I finish counseling them, right? Things keep going on. I took up, one of my favorite classes in college was horticulture. I was terrible at chemistry. And I had to have a science class with a lab. And so the one class I could take without all the chemistry was horticulture, which is just cultivating plants. And I found out I was decent at it. And to this day, I have trees in my backyard that I took from seed on my college campus, these huge trees, that I grew from seedlings that are now just huge trees in my backyard. It's so fun. They're called albizia trees. What's interesting about them is that their leaves, when the sun goes down, the leaves fold. And then when the sun comes up, they react to the sunlight. It's kind of a nice proverb. It's kind of what we should do with God, right? If we go away from God, we kind of fold, but we respond to His grace. It's so great to walk in my backyard and say, hey, that tree's older than my kids. You have to be able to create beauty in your life, right? Does that make sense to you? Yeah. And so you want to be able to develop each of these as you're going along. I mean, we're not perfect at it, but think about that. What are you, you might have this as a very strong area, but another area might be more challenging. How would we balance those? So this actually comes across in what's called virtue ethics. Yeah.
Is there more contradictions there? Like you mentioned that you can be very knowledgeable and not morally good. You can be morally good and not have knowledge and therefore do that. Is there more contradictions within that?
Yeah. I don't know if it's contradictions. I would say you become anemic, right? It's like your muscles going atrophy. They're not strong. So artists can do incredible art, but fail to be good persons. Take Picasso. If you look at the history of his life, the way he treated women and other things was just horrific. You can. I think I pointed most of them out. I don't know. Is there anything you see that I'm missing?
What about the spiritual one?
Yeah, you can be, as a pastor, you can know the Bible really well, but fail to know God or be in a good relationship. So there's a lot of theologians, could be philosophers too, I can pick on me, who are super smart, could pick out any verse, tell you the theories, but they lack a deep moral character. How many times have we heard fairly recently about a pastor's failing or a fairly prominent musician abandoning the faith? Sometimes a musician could be really great, even at writing worship songs, but fail to grow intellectually and they abandon their faith. So that's why you want to be careful that you're not too weak in one of these. Thanks. That means I'm done. I'm out. Yeah. You see anything else there? I'm just curious. Yeah.
What I find interesting is you can know God really well and you can be doing all the right things and you can know a lot about the Bible. If you're failing to see the beauty, you end up really depressed. And that's something that God actually pointed out to me a month ago because I was trying my best to know Him and do the right things and read the Bible, but I was just not appreciating the beauty of life and the fact that moments are good and things like that, and then I ended up super depressed. So
Depressed because you weren't recognizing the beauty in the world? Yeah. Yeah, this is why when I know some of you are studying, want to be counselors or that. We had a program where we worked with kids who were going through, their parents or their family were going through divorces, right? One of the best things that we could do for them is we would give them music lessons, art lessons, things that created beauty, and then while we're doing it, you have conversations, and they just open up. Especially boys, actually, like playing a sport or doing something like that. So shooting baskets and start talking about what's going on in their heart and minds. Start talking. But if you sit there and just talk to them, get them active, get them playing Call of Duty. Just kidding. Yeah, it's a really important part. So something to think about. Any other thoughts or questions on comments on what we've talked about? Has this been helpful? You can be honest. Like, do you feel like there's some holes there? That you feel like you're missing anything?
Another one I see in a lot of non-believers is the top three. They appreciate beauty, they're morally good, they're knowledgeable, and they reject anything spiritual.
Yeah, especially in universities today, this is emphasized, this is rejected, this can be emphasized, and there's a new set of absolutes. And you're demanded to follow them. It's a really interesting environment. It's not that there isn't any morality, it's switched. It's flipped to a new set of absolutes. Tolerance or something, yeah.
Are these the only 4 categories that you guys have found?
So for virtue ethicists, these are the main dimensions of human life, I would say. And probably what might be going on in your mind, you might say, well, what about community or relationships? Isn't that a dimension? I would say community fits as what you would put here is the means or the way to accomplish these things. So you can't accomplish these goals or these ends arguably without community. Even the monks, right, what did they do? They left society, but they gathered together, right? Human beings were meant to be in relationships. So I think relationships and community are one of the means to achieve this. Does that make sense? Because a lot of people want to put relationships or community or something else down here, and I think those are actually the means to accomplish that. One other, you call it a contradiction. Some people who pursue the spiritual life neglect the creation and the beauty that they can create out of it. So this is why we should emphasize Christians going into science. Because science is a God-ordained endeavor to discover what God did in the world. It's a pointer back to him. So I think we want to encourage people. If you get into leadership or that, I think it's good to encourage younger people to become in the STEM fields, right, for those things. Yeah.
Just want to add on to what you were saying. I think it was a really cool quote I heard a while back, and I'm totally going to butcher it, but it was like, the more you learn about this world and the more you study the sciences of this world, the more miraculous miracle becomes.
Huh. I like that. Let's put that on a shirt.
That was Charles Darwin.
Great. Actually, Darwin has some very, very choice quotes that are very interesting. Well, his father was a minister, right? So, any other comments? You guys are hungry, huh? I can see you eating the jokes. All right. What we're going to do is tomorrow. Rick allowed me. I'm going to do a session in the morning. But we're going to deal with an ethical issue, okay? So what I would like to do, one of the most prominent ones right now, and it's actually I think what I have to present would be very helpful to you, but it's on the issue of abortion. And it's how to argue the pro-life case actually without using the Bible. I think the Bible is a slam dunk for the pro-life position. But how do you engage someone who doesn't hold the Bible as authoritative on a deep and tremendous ethical issue. Let me just tell you briefly why I think that's so important. Two Italian philosophers argued a few years back for something called afterbirth abortion. And here's what they argued.
Infanticide.
It's basically infanticide. So they argued that every argument that we have on behalf of abortion, because they assume that abortion is justified, also justifies killing infants. And now you're going to start to see a move in various states. Not only, we've already seen it, not only to have abortion all the way up to, and it's legalized in California, all the way up to just prior to birth, right? So what they call late-term abortions, where you partially deliver the child, you crush the skull, and once it's dead, you deliver the rest of it, right? What they're arguing is that makes no difference. We can actually kill kids up to about between 6 months to 18 months after they're born. And we would be justified in doing that for a number of reasons, they argue. So this is what's coming down the scene, and just you'll start to see it more and more. And I think we should engage with the issue and be ready to address the challenge. And I think there's some good arguments of why that's not only immoral but evil. So be prepared. We're going to do that in the morning. Sorry, that's bright and early. But I actually think you'll really engage with some of the arguments that I think will equip you on that. All right? Will someone pray for our lunch as we go down? Is somebody willing to do that? Yeah, please, Katie. Pray for us.